Today, we are continuing in the book of Mark. We're going to be at the very end of chapter 4. And we're going to be talking about Jesus calming the storm. And if you notice, the title of the message today is Lord of the Winds and Waves. And so we're going to see how Jesus is in control of everything that we see and understand. Next week, we're going to talk about Jesus is in control of everything we can't see and don't understand. But this week, we're going to talk about that. And I really thought that the beginning, the first part of this verse in the psalm, frail children of dust, and feeble as frail, in thee do we trust, nor do we find thee to fail. Really embody the message today as we see that we are in need of God deeply, that we are in need of Him because we are frail. And in Him do we put our trust and our faith. And so the main point of today is that Jesus is worth putting your faith in. But as we look at the story today, we're going to see that this comes in the midst of the storms, much like what Mike pointed out at the very beginning of the service today. That it's not that we have easy sailing all the way through, but that we trust Him through those storms. So let's go ahead and read our story today, and then we'll jump right into those main points. It's going to be from Mark chapter 4. We're going to read verses 35 through 41. Mark chapter 4, beginning with verse 35. That day when evening came, He said to His disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took Him along, just as He was in a boat. And there were also other boats with Him. And a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. And Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples awoke Him and said to Him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up and rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And the wind died down and it was completely calm. And He said to His disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were terrified, and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey Him." Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank You so much that You are the Lord of the winds and waves. Jesus, I thank You that You have displayed that to us. That You are the full glory of the Father. That You, fully God and fully man, have allowed us to see a glimpse of Your glory, and that one day we'll see You face to face. God, I pray that we be in all of that today, that we let the Scriptures draw us closer to You, drive us into a deeper relationship of trust and faith. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. I love this story. There's so much to unpack here. But the first thing that we see in this story is that the storms will come. I want you to think a little bit about what's happening here and the people that are involved. That even though Jesus was in the boat with them, they still faced the storm. And think about who is in the boat. The disciples. These are not people that have rejected Jesus, that have said, "No, I don't think I want to believe in Him. I don't want to be near Him. I don't want to have anything to do with Him." These are the ones that have said, "Yes, there's something special about Jesus. I want to learn more about Him. I want to follow Him. I'm going to give up everything that I've got, and I'm going to follow Jesus." And yet, they find themselves in the midst of a storm. The reality is that the storms are going to come, whether you know Jesus or not. We even have eyewitness details in this story. I love whenever I'm reading to find these eyewitness details because they remind me that this is actually an event that happened, and they remind me of the authenticity of what has been recorded. We see as the story is being told, we see, first of all, that the disciples go along with Jesus, and it says in verse 36, leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, meaning Jesus, just as he was in the boat. Now, honestly, we don't know exactly what that means. It probably means that he was already seated in the boat. Maybe he was exhausted and didn't want to get out of the boat. But they took him along just as he was, even though he's the one that said, let's go over to the other side. And we have this detail in knowing that basically he stayed in the boat. And then the same verse there says there were also other boats with him. Really, this is an ordinary day for Jesus and his disciples. Jesus has spent the day teaching the crowds as there are so many people around him, as he's probably in the boat teaching on the edge of the water as they're gathered on the shoreline. And then he's tired and he said, let's go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they go over to the other side. Nothing unusual about this day. Matter of fact, there was nothing much unusual about a serious storm coming in on the Sea of Galilee. It was really quite common. And you didn't want to be caught out in one of these storms. And so in this ordinary day, with these guys that are following Jesus, the storm comes up. Even with Jesus in the boat, they're almost swamped by the storm. The disciples, these guys that had left their families and jobs to follow Jesus and to learn from him, they were the ones willing to listen to what he had to say, trying to understand it, and yet they face a storm. As I mentioned, we will face storms. Jesus is not a cure-all for all of your problems. With or without him, you will face pain, suffering, loss, and difficulty in this life. This brings us kind of to a difficult question. And that is, if Jesus has the ability to stop all bad things from happening, why doesn't he? And the reality is, I can't pretend to have a clear and complete understanding of the mind of God. But I think I can help you work through this some. First of all, we have to recognize that none of us are deserving of life. The Bible makes it very clear that we have all earned death because of our rebellion against God. And so any life that we have is mercy on God's part. Secondly, God's goodness stands in direct contrast to the brokenness of this world. It's not marred by the darkness, but it shines brightly through it. Oftentimes, whenever we see something bad happening or we have to face something that's not fair, we think that mars or hides the goodness of God. But in reality, the goodness of God shines forth in spite of those things that are happening. Exactly why God allows some storms to rage on and some he calms, some of them he calms, I don't have a complete answer. But I can tell you that all of Scripture tells us that we are called to be in a growing and healthy relationship with God. That is the focus of why we are here on this earth. It's not so much about having a smooth ride in that process, but it's about knowing him through the process. And so I can tell you that each thing we face, whenever handled in such a relationship, in a deep and growing relationship with God will bring him glory and will strengthen that relationship even more. And so the reality that we come to at the very beginning of this passage is that the storms will come. But it's much better to face them with Jesus than without. Because as we face these things, we begin to recognize who he is, and that relationship grows. The second thing I want to point out is that faith is necessary. Now, the first thing that comes to mind whenever I say that is, well, what is faith? Because faith is used a lot. The word is used a lot. Sometimes we talk about different denominations and we say, well, they're of that faith. Sometimes we talk about it more in the sense of hoping that something will happen. I have faith that it's going to happen. A good place to go for the answer to that question is Hebrews chapter 11. Many of you may be familiar with this chapter because it's called the Hall of Faith, or the chapter of faith. In verse 1, we see kind of a definition, a biblical definition of what faith is. It's described as the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. Faith is this assurance of things that I cannot see, conviction that they are true. Faith works in conjunction with humility. We must admit that we don't know everything, that we cannot see everything, and that we do not have full control of things in order for us to be able to trust that someone else is in control, to have that faith. And so not only does Hebrews chapter 11 kind of present us with this picture of what faith is, but then it gives us some examples of what it looks like. I'm going to go through the first part of them and kind of walk through those. The first thing that he goes into directly after giving us this definition is he begins to point out that trusting that God created the universe out of nothing is an example of faith. Because the reality is we weren't there. We didn't see it. The reality is we can't even comprehend that because we cannot create anything out of nothing. And he says that there's faith there. And then he continues on. He talks about Abel and the sacrifice that he gave in faith. It had to do with his attitude that he came before God with. And he humbly trusted God that the offering that he had was good and acceptable. And yet he died doing that. It says by faith he offered the sacrifice, and then his blood still cries out because his brother allowed evil to creep in. And then on the opposite side of that, we have Enoch. This guy trusted God and walked with him, and because of that, he did not see death. He was taken to be with God. These two guys, very different stories, showing the same faith that God was in control, that the things that they could not see and understand, God was in control of. And it talks about Noah, who prepared the ark, though it made no sense. He hadn't seen rain before, and yet he prepared an ark, a big boat, because God told him to. Abraham left his home and went to a place that God had prepared, though he didn't know where he was going until God revealed it. His wife Sarah, in faith, held to the promise that God would fulfill and bring her a child, even though she was beyond childbearing age. None of these people saw the big picture of how God was working. Some of them saw some kind of fulfillment, but they never saw the full fulfillment of what God was doing through history to bring Jesus Christ. Yet they had faith that God would do what He said and that He was in control. Throughout the chapter of Hebrews chapter 11, he goes on to describe many other trials and difficulties that people face. And yet each one, in each circumstance, they keep their eye on God, trusting in things that are not seen. The inheritance that we share beyond this world and the work of God through broken humanity, these two things are both examples of things that we cannot see. But we have confidence. If we have faith, the Word of God is true. So while many things on this earth we can see, God's work behind the scenes, doing these things, creating what He's creating, we cannot see. And it begins to be a reliance on faith. What does faith look like in our story today in Mark chapter 5? Well, it starts off out, I would say, much smaller than you think. Because I do think that the disciples displayed some faith in this situation. They turned to Jesus. This took a certain amount of faith. They had to trust that Jesus could help them. They knew that He could save them, which is why they complained to Him. Think about it. Why is it that we complain to a manager at a store or a restaurant? We don't complain to the wait staff as much as we complain to the manager. Why? Because we think they can do something about it. Because we trust that they're the ones that can handle the situation. And in this case, the disciples turn to Jesus. Look at what they say. In verse 38, Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke Him and said to Him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" They go and they say, "Don't you care? You can do something about this." It took a certain amount of faith to even go this far. They knew that He could save them. They complained to Him. The next time that you're complaining to God, realize it took a certain amount of faith to even get that far. Yet, Jesus doesn't just leave them there. Jesus challenges them forward. He says to them, "Why are you so afraid? You still have no faith." The first part, "Why are you so afraid?" brings us to another question. We got a lot of questions when we go through this passage. Is it wrong to be afraid? The simple answer to that is no. It's a natural human emotion. I have a book that talks about emotions, and it describes them like smoke alarms. It was a perfect picture in my head of why we have emotions and what these emotions, these strong emotions that we face, what are they for? They're alarms to let us know that something's not right. When things aren't right, oftentimes we become afraid. We begin looking for ways to no longer be afraid, to get us out of that situation. And what Jesus is telling them, He's wanting them to realize that God is the one that can calm their fears. It's not wrong to fear, but that fear should drive us to trust in God. The second thing Jesus says to them is, "Do you still have no faith?" That's the interpretation that we have. I feel like the Greek phrase, as best I can understand it, is a little closer to, "Why have you not yet taken hold of your faith?" Why have you not yet taken hold of your faith? There was something there, as I mentioned. I do think that they had this enough faith to be able to say, Jesus, you can do something about it. Wake up. But yet, they were bold enough to run to Jesus, but it was not something they had fully accepted as true yet. They hadn't taken hold of it. If they had actually taken hold of it, I think that they could have been sleeping in the hole with Jesus. You think about it, rest is another great example of faith. If you can go to bed at night and rest, then you're able to say, I'm putting my faith in God, that He will take care of things while I am completely helpless. I'm putting my faith in God, that He is in control over things and not me. And maybe you're like the disciples today. There's something there that's driving you towards God, but you've not yet taken hold of it. In order to take hold of faith, as I mentioned, it works in conjunction with humility. You have to let go of your control and your pride. And that's hard. That's a vulnerable place to be. You have to admit that He's in control and He knows better than you. And that's a scary place. But when you get there, God provides. We begin to see the necessity of faith in life as we face these storms and trusting that God is in control more than I am. And that brings us to the last point, which is Jesus is enough. This is what I love about this story. In this story, Jesus shows His disciples that He is Lord over the winds and the waves. That He's Lord over creation. He's more than capable of taking care of them. Oftentimes whenever we talk about spiritual things, we bring faith into the picture and we tend to tie it too much to our own faith. Have you ever heard somebody say, you just have to have enough faith? It's not about the amount of faith that we have. The illustration that Mike used last week of the mustard seed and faith shows us it's not so much about the amount of faith that I have, but it's about where I put that faith in. It's about the person of Jesus who's capable of handling everything I trust in Him for. The power to save is not in our faith, but it's in the person that we put our faith in. It's interesting, if you begin to think about this, and you kind of begin to think about the situations and what could have happened, Jesus didn't have to calm that storm. They could have woken Him up and said, Jesus, don't you care that we're drowning? And He'd say, it's okay, I'll stay with you. I'll be here with you through whatever happens in this storm. He could have said that, and that would have been enough. In this case, He chose to display His glory, to show them, I am capable of taking care of you. But He is enough whether He displays that or not. He didn't have to calm the storm, but He chose to confirm the message that He had been telling them, that He is Lord of all, that He is God in the flesh, that He will never leave you or forsake you, that He can be there for you in all circumstances. What a wonderful reminder we have in the story, that Jesus is enough even in life's storms. We're reminded that He's worth putting our faith in. And then the result of this is worship. The disciples, I don't know if I would describe it quite as worship, but they were on their way there. They were scared, they were confused, and they said, who is this guy? that even the winds and the waves obeyed. They stood in awe and wonder as Jesus responded and said, I am here with you. I will take care of you. Can we simply be in awe and wonder of who Jesus is? That He's the one that can take care of us. That He's the one that will walk with us through life's storms. That ultimately He is greater than these storms. We can hope in Him because He is beyond this world, and our relationship with Him will last forever no matter what happens on this earth. But it all begins with knowing Him and trusting Him. That faith is a personal faith. Walking with Him. Knowing Him. And so I pray that every person in this church today, every person watching on Facebook, knows Jesus personally. If you haven't begun to put your faith in Him, sometimes it takes those small steps, like it did with the disciples, and saying, you know what, there's something to this Jesus. Whatever it is, if you are trusting in Jesus in that very first step, or you've known Jesus for a while, and you feel like you need to trust Him some more, you need to walk with Him some more, pray that you commit to do that today.